The wine glass in front of me had a smudge on the rim. That's what I was looking at when my daughter told me she'd been forging my signature for 18 months. Not at her, not at her husband, at a thumbprint on crystal, in a restaurant where the bread cost what some folks pay for groceries. I let her finish. That was the hardest part, letting her finish. My name is Walden Croft. I'm 68 years old, and until that Tuesday in October, I believed that the worst thing my children could do to me had already been done when their mother passed and they showed up late to the funeral. I was wrong about that. I'm wrong about a lot of things, but I'm rarely wrong twice about the same person. Let me back up. My wife, Rosemary, died on a Thursday in March 3 years ago. Pancreatic. We had 8 weeks from diagnosis to the morning she stopped breathing in our bed with my hand on her chest. 8 weeks isn't enough time to say what you need to say to a woman you've been married to for 41 years. It's enough time to say the important things twice, maybe 3 times, and then sit in silence and hold her hand while the morphine does what the morphine does. We had 2 children. Have. I have 2 children. Have. I have 2 children even now. A son named Porter and a daughter named Whitley. Porter is 42, an orthopedic surgeon in Charleston with 3 kids of his own and a wife I genuinely like named Adrian. Porter is not the problem. Porter calls me every Sunday at 5:30 and lets the grandkids fight over the phone for 10 minutes, and then asks me how my knee is doing. Porter is fine. Whitley is the problem. Whitley was always the problem, and Rosemary knew it, and I knew it, and we pretended we didn't, because that's what you do when you love a child who doesn't quite love you back the same way. Whitley is 39. She married a man named Brendan Kaspruzak when she was 26, against our advice, in a courthouse with 2 witnesses neither of us had ever met. We found out about the marriage 6 weeks after it happened in a Christmas card. Rosemary cried for an hour and then put on lipstick and made a roast and welcomed him into our home. That was the kind of woman she was. Brendan sells commercial real estate, or rather, Brendan tries to sell commercial real estate. And when he fails to sell commercial real estate, he sells the idea that he's about to sell commercial real estate. And when that fails too, he borrows money from people who shouldn't be lending it. I didn't know all of this when Rosemary was alive. I learned it slowly. The way you learn that a roof is leaking. First a stain, then a sag, then water in the soup pot you put on the floor. Anyway, back to the wine glass. I built a company. I should mention that. Croft Industrial Fasteners. Started in 1981 in a rented garage in Greenville with a $6,000 loan from my father-in-law and a wife who typed invoices on a Smith Corona while I drove the truck. By 2019, we had 4 plants, 312 employees, and contracts with 2 of the 3 biggest aerospace companies in the country. I sold 70% of the company in 2021 and kept the rest along with a board seat I almost never use. The number doesn't matter. It's enough that I don't worry about it, and it's enough that other people worry about it for me. Whitley knew the number. Porter, to his credit, has never asked. Whitley asked the day after the funeral. The restaurant that Tuesday was Adrian's idea, indirectly. She told Porter she was worried about me eating frozen meals alone in the house, and Porter, being Porter, suggested I let Whitley take me out to dinner sometimes. I'd been saying yes for about a year. It was usually her treat on a card I later realized I was paying for anyway. We met every 6 or 8 weeks at a place called Velasco's, downtown. White tablecloths, the kind of place where the waiter introduces himself by first name and then disappears for 45 minutes. That night she'd brought Brendan. That was unusual. Usually it was just the 2 of us. I should have known something was off when I walked in and saw him at the table fidgeting with his cufflinks. Brendan doesn't fidget unless he's about to ask for something. We ordered. Whitley got the sea bass. Brendan got the ribeye, of course, because Brendan always gets the most expensive thing and then complains about it. I got the trout because I like trout and because at my age I've earned the right to order what I want without consulting anyone. We talked about nothing for 20 minutes. The grandkids. Porter's youngest, a girl named Maple, had won a swimming ribbon. Whitley nodded a lot and didn't ask follow-up questions. Brendan checked his phone 3 times. Then, somewhere between the salad and the entree, Whitley set down her fork and said, "Daddy, we need to talk about something." I knew. I knew before she said the next word. There's a tone fathers learn. It's the tone Whitley used at 16 when she put a dent in the Buick. It's the tone she used at 22 when she dropped out of her second graduate program. It's the tone of a person who has already done the thing and is now informing you of it. I set down my fork too. I set down my fork too. I said, "We've been having some cash flow issues." Brendan jumped in. Temporary. Very temporary. The Pemberton deal is closing in February, and once that hits, we're golden. But in the meantime... I held up one finger. He stopped. That's a thing I learned from my own father, and it still works on most men. One finger. "Quiet," I said. "Whitley, go ahead." She picked up her wine and put it down without drinking. She said, "We took out a line of credit against the house in Asheville." Now, the house in Asheville, that requires its own explanation, because the house in Asheville is the thing that broke me. And the thing she said next is the thing that ended us. When Rosemary got sick, she made me promise her 2 things. The first was that I'd let her go when it was time, which I did. The second was that the cabin in Asheville would stay in the family. Her family. Rosemary's grandfather built that cabin in 1934 out of timber he cut himself off the ridge above the property. Her father was born in the front bedroom. Rosemary spent every summer there until she was 19. We honeymooned there because we couldn't afford anywhere else, and we took Porter and Whitley there every July for 22 years. When Rosemary was dying, we sat down with our lawyer and put the cabin into a trust. Whitley was named trustee because Porter was already busy with his practice, and Whitley said she wanted to be involved. The trust said clearly, in language I read 3 times before signing, that the cabin could not be sold, could not be mortgaged, and could not be used as collateral for any debt. The trust said the cabin would pass to my grandchildren on my death. Rosemary signed it on a Tuesday. She died on a Thursday 10 days later. So when Whitley said, "We took out a line of credit against the house in Asheville," I didn't move. I didn't blink. I said, very quietly, "Whitley, that trust doesn't allow that." She looked at the tablecloth. Brendan looked at the ceiling. She said, "I had it amended." I said, "By whom?" She said, "I had Brendan's brother draw it up. He's a lawyer in Atlanta. It's all legal, Daddy, I checked." I said, "Whitley, look at me. Whose signature is on the amendment?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. I already knew. There's a particular kind of cold that goes through a man when he realizes his daughter has forged his name on a document that disinherits his grandchildren. It starts in the chest and moves down. It's not anger. Anger comes later. The first thing is just cold, like someone opened a window in a room you didn't know had a window. I said, "How much?" She said, $320,000. I said, "On a cabin that's worth $600. Brendan said, "It's worth more than that now, the market in Asheville." I held up the finger again. He shut up again. I said, "How long has this been going on?" Whitley said, "About a year and a half. I said, "And you're telling me now because?" Brendan said, "Because we're underwater on the payments and the bank is moving toward foreclosure and we need you to sign a guarantee so we can refinance." He said it fast, the way men say things they've practiced in the car on the way over. He said it like a closing line in one of his deals. He even leaned forward when he said it, like he was about to slide a contract across the table. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at my daughter. I said, "You forged my signature to take out a loan against your mother's family home, and now you've come to dinner to ask me to legitimize it after the fact. Because if I don't, the cabin she promised her grandchildren goes to a bank." Whitley started crying. Real crying. The kind I'd seen from her exactly twice in her adult life, once when her dog died, and once when she didn't get into the sorority she wanted. She said, "Daddy, please. The kids are going to lose their school. We're going to lose the cars. Brendan's going to lose his license to sell." I said, "Whitley, stop." And here's the moment. Here's the moment I want you to picture, because it's the moment I think about every day, and it's the moment that made everything else possible. Brendan, my son-in-law, the man my dead wife had welcomed into her home with a roast and a smile, leaned across the table and said, "Walden, be reasonable. It's just money." "Rosemary would have wanted you to help us." He said my dead wife's name. He used my dead wife's name to leverage me, and I felt something shift inside me that I cannot fully describe to you, except to say it was the same feeling I had the morning Rosemary stopped breathing. A door closing. A specific door that you didn't even know was a door, closing in a way you understand will never open again. I picked up my wine glass. I looked at the smudge on the rim, the one I'd been staring at the whole conversation. I poured the wine slowly onto Brendan's plate, onto the ribeye he hadn't finished. The waiter who was passing stopped and pretended he hadn't seen. I said, "You don't get to say her name." Then I stood up. I put $400 on the table. I walked out of Velasco's and into the parking lot and got into my truck and drove home and did not cry. I did not call anyone. I sat in my kitchen in the chair Rosemary used to sit in, and I drank a glass of water, and I made a list on a yellow legal pad. The list had 9 items. By Friday morning, I had finished 7 of them. The first thing I did Wednesday morning at 7 a.m. was call my attorney, not the family lawyer who'd drawn up the trust. A different one, a woman named Constance Yeager who'd handled the company sale and who I trusted with my life. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting for 11 minutes, which is one of the reasons I pay her what I pay her. When I finished, she said, "Walden, do you want to prosecute?" I said, "I want to think about that." She said, "You have 90 days under the statute. Don't think too long. Meanwhile, what do you want to do today?" I said, "I want to know exactly what she signed. I want every document. I want to know what bank, what amount, what date, and I want to know how many other signatures of mine she may have used." Constance said, "I'll have it by Friday." It took her until Thursday afternoon. She drove out to my house herself. She sat at my kitchen table and laid out 14 documents in chronological order. There were 3 forgeries. The trust amendment, a personal guarantee on the line of credit, and a power of attorney dated 8 months prior that gave Whitley authority to act on my behalf in certain financial matters. The power of attorney had been used twice, once to refinance her own house in Charlotte, where she'd taken $140,000 in cash out of the equity, and once to open a brokerage account in my name that had received 3 deposits totaling $62,000 and then transferred those funds to an LLC owned by Brendan. Constance let me look at the documents in silence for about 20 minutes. Then she said, "Walden, I have to ask you again, do you want to prosecute?" I said, "Tell me what prosecution looks like." She said, "Federal wire fraud, almost certainly. Bank fraud, probably forgery and elder financial abuse under state law. 10 to 15 years federal, easily. Brendan likely more, because he's the one moving the money." I said, "And Whitley?" She said, "Whitley's the one whose signature appears on the documents next to your forged one. She's the principal. Brendan is the accessory on paper. In practice, they go down together, but Whitley is the name on the indictment." I said, "What happens to the grandchildren?" She said, "If both parents go to prison, the children go to next of kin. That's your call." I sat with that for a long time. I thought about Porter, who didn't deserve to inherit 2 more children at 42. I thought about Adrian, who would say yes anyway because she's a good woman. I thought about Whitley's 3 kids, Beatrix, who was 11, Saxon, who was 9, and a 4-year-old named Wren, who had done absolutely nothing to anyone and who would lose their mother to a federal prison if I picked up the phone and said the word. I said, "Constance, I don't want them in prison." She said, "Then we have other options. But you need to decide what you do want, because doing nothing is not actually an option here. They will do this again. or worse, and the next time maybe after you're not in a position to stop it. I said, give me until Sunday. She gave me until Sunday. That was Thursday. Friday morning, I drove to Asheville, 5.5 hours by myself with the radio off most of the way. I got to the cabin at 1 in the afternoon. The keys still worked. Of course they did. The cabin was exactly as Rosemary and I had left it the September before she got sick. Her reading glasses were on the side table next to the rocker. The coffee tin in the kitchen still had her handwriting on the label. The quilt on the back of the couch was the one her grandmother had made in 1952. I walked through every room. I sat in the rocker for an hour. I drank a beer on the porch and watched a hawk work a thermal above the ridge. Then I drove into town and met with a realtor named Marjorie Hollins, who Constance had recommended. Marjorie is in her 50s, no nonsense, the kind of woman who tells you what something is worth and then tells you what she can sell it for and explains the difference. I told her I wanted to sell the cabin. I told her I wanted to sell it for cash, fast, and I told her I didn't care if I left $30,000 on the table. Marjorie said, "You sure?" I said, "My wife's grandfather built that cabin. My wife wanted it to stay in the family. The family doesn't deserve it anymore. I would rather a stranger have it than a thief." Marjorie said, "I'll have an offer by Monday." She had 3 offers by Monday. I took the second one. Cash, no contingencies. Close in 11 days. $640,000. I drove back to Greenville that Friday night. On the way, I called Porter. I asked him to come over Saturday morning, alone if possible. He said he'd be there at 10. I sat at the kitchen table with my son Saturday morning and I told him everything. Every document, every dollar, every detail. He didn't interrupt. He's a surgeon. He knows how to hear bad news. When I finished, he said, "Dad, what do you need from me?" I said, "I don't need anything from you, son. I needed you to know." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to make it so that your sister and her husband cannot do this again. I'm going to do it within the law, and I am not going to put their children's mother in prison if I can help it. But your sister, as of yesterday, is no longer my daughter in any meaningful sense, and I need you to understand that and not try to talk me out of it." Porter sat for a long time. Then he said, "Mom would have wanted you to help her, Dad, and here's where I have to give my son credit." Because what he said next is something I will remember as long as I live. He paused, and he looked at me, and he said, "But Mom would also not have wanted her cabin to be the leverage, and Mom would not have wanted you ground down by this. So whatever you decide, I'm with you." I cried then, not for long. I'm not built for it. But I cried, and Porter sat with me and didn't say anything, and after a while we drank coffee and talked about Maple's swimming. Sunday I called Constance and gave her my decision. Here's what I decided. Here's what I told her. I would not prosecute. Not because Whitley deserved my mercy, but because the grandchildren did. But I would do 5 things. 1, I would sell the cabin and put the proceeds into a trust for the grandchildren, including Whitley's 3, that they could access at 25 for education or first homes only. Whitley's name would be nowhere on the trust. Brendan's name would be nowhere on the trust. Porter would be co-trustee with Constance. 2, I would pay off the fraudulent line of credit at the Asheville Bank in full on the day of closing. I would also pay off the cash-out refinance on Whitley's house in Charlotte. Both payoffs would come with a letter, signed by me and notarized, stating that the original loans had been obtained through forgery, that I had paid them off to protect my credit and the bank's, and that I waived any future claim against either institution. Constance would also send a copy of that letter, along with copies of the forged documents, to Whitley and to Brendan, registered mail. 3, I would revoke the power of attorney, freeze all accounts that had ever been associated with my name and Whitley's name jointly, change every password, and put a fraud alert on my credit. Constance would coordinate with a forensic accountant to make sure I hadn't missed anything. 4, I would rewrite my will. Porter and his children would inherit the residual estate, which after the trust for the grandchildren and a few charitable bequests was still a considerable amount. Whitley would receive $1, with a letter attached that read, in full, "This is the same amount of trust I have left in you. Spend it wisely." Brendan would receive nothing and was named in the will as a person specifically excluded from any consideration. 5. I would never speak to either of them again. Not at Christmas. Not on birthdays. Not on school recitals. I would see my grandchildren, when Whitley permitted it, through Porter and Adrian, who would act as intermediaries. If Whitley refused to allow contact, then I would not have contact. The grandchildren would learn the truth when they were old enough to ask. Constance read the list back to me over the phone. When she finished, she said, "Walden, are you sure?" I said, "Constance, I have been sure for 48 hours, and I will be sure tomorrow and the day after. Do it." She did it. The cabin closed 11 days later. The wire transfers to the 2 banks went out the same afternoon. The registered letters went out the next morning. Constance called me Wednesday and said, "It's done. They have everything." Whitley called me 47 times in the next 9 days. I did not answer. She left voicemails. I did not listen. She emailed. I did not read. She drove 3 hours and showed up at my front door with Brendan on a Saturday afternoon. I was on the porch reading when they pulled into the driveway. I watched her get out. I watched Brendan get out. They stood by the car for a moment, talking. Then they came up the walk. Whitley said, "Daddy." I said, "You don't get to call me that anymore." She said, "Please, please, please, the kids." I said, "The kids will be taken care of. They have a trust. They have an uncle. They have a grandmother on your husband's side, presumably. They are not my responsibility to raise. They are yours. You should have remembered that before you signed my name to a document that took their inheritance away from them." Brennan said, "Walden, look. Let's just talk about this like men." I stood up. I am 6'2". I was an athlete in college. I am 68 years old, but I still split my own wood, and Brendan Kasprasek is 5'9" and sells real estate. I said, "Brendan, you are on my property. You have 90 seconds to be off it. After that, I am calling the sheriff and pressing trespassing charges, and if you ever come back, I am pressing the fraud charges I am currently choosing not to press. Do you understand me?" He understood me. Whitley was crying again. She said, "Daddy, I'm your daughter." I said, "You were. You stopped being my daughter the moment you decided $320,000 was worth more to you than your mother's grandfather's house. I am sorry for your children. I am not sorry for you. Get off my porch." They left. I watched the car back out of the driveway and turn east on the county road and disappear behind the line of pines at the property edge. Then I sat back down and finished the chapter I'd been reading. The next morning, I called my travel agent. I have a travel agent, which sounds old-fashioned, but at my age, you earn the right to old-fashioned things. Her name is Donna, and she's been booking my trips since 1994. I said, "Donna, I want to go somewhere for a while." She said, "How long is a while?" I said, 3 months, maybe 4. She said, "Where?" I said, "Somewhere with mountains and somewhere with water. Not at the same time. 2 stops, 1 with each." She said, "I'll have options by Friday." I left on November 14th. 3 weeks after the dinner at Velasco's, I flew to Bariloche in Argentina and stayed in a lodge on a lake under the Andes for 6 weeks. I fished. I read. I learned about 30 words of Spanish from a woman named Mariela who ran the lodge with her husband and who fed me lamb at a long table with 8 other guests every night and who never once asked me what I did for a living or what I was running from. From there, I flew to the southwest coast of Ireland and rented a stone cottage outside a town called Dingle. And I walked the cliffs every morning and ate brown bread and drank Guinness in a pub called Murphy's, where the bartender, an old man named Declan, taught me to play a dice game I have since forgotten. I came home in early March, 2 days before what would have been my 44th wedding anniversary. Porter picked me up at the airport. On the drive home, he said, "Dad, there's news. Whitley filed for divorce in January." I said, "Mum." He said, "Brendan's brother in Atlanta isn't a lawyer. He never was. He was disbarred in 2017, and he's been answering phones at a strip mall law office in Marietta. The amendment to the trust was never actually filed with the court. Constance found out in December. It means the trust was never legally altered." I said, He said, "Dad, the cabin was still legally protected. You didn't have to sell it." I drove the next half-mile in silence. Then I said, "Porter, I know." He looked at me. He said, "You knew." I said, "Constance told me on the Saturday, before I called you." The amendment was never filed because Brendan's brother is a fraud, and Whitley either didn't know or didn't care. The bank loan was real because the bank doesn't check trust amendments at the county courthouse before issuing a line of credit. They just check signatures. But the cabin was always going to be the grandchildren's. He said, "Then why?" I said, "Because the cabin wasn't the point. The point was that your sister sat across from me at dinner and used your dying mother's wishes as leverage against me. The cabin was a thing. Things can be replaced. Your mother's memory cannot be used as collateral on a real estate loan. That's the thing I sold the cabin for, to make sure none of them could ever do that again." Porter drove for another mile. Then he said, "Dad, that's the most cold-hearted thing I have ever heard you say, and I think Mom would have agreed with every word. I think she would have too. I'm telling you this now, sitting on a different porch in a different house. I sold the Greenville place last summer. I bought a smaller one on the coast in a town I'm not going to name because I'd like to keep it to myself. Porter comes down with Adrian and the kids 3 or 4 times a year. Maple is 13 now and a freshman swimmer, and she still wins ribbons. Beatrix, my oldest granddaughter from Whitley, turned 14 last month, and Porter brought her down for a long weekend, alone, with her mother's grudging permission. We fished. We didn't talk about her mother. She asked me about her grandmother, and I told her stories for 2 hours, and she cried a little, and so did I. Whitley is remarried to an accountant in Raleigh. Brendan pled out of a different fraud case last year, unrelated to mine. I don't follow it closely. Porter tells me what I need to know. I have not seen Whitley in 4 years and 2 months. I do not expect I will see her again before I die. If she comes to my funeral, Porter has instructions about where she may and may not sit. I have made peace with that. Peace is the wrong word. I have made arrangements. Peace will come when it comes, or it won't. And either way, I have a porch and a fishing rod and a son who calls me on Sundays and a wife I will see again, I hope, in whatever comes next, and to whom I will be able to say that I kept her cabin in the family in the only way that still meant something. That's the story. That's the whole story. Make of it what you will. I've thought about that night at Velasco's more times than I can count. Not the wine on the ribeye. Not even the moment Brendan used my dead wife's name like a crowbar. I've thought about the 18 months before it, the 18 months when Whitley was forging my signature, opening accounts in my name, moving money she had no right to move, and still sitting across from me every 6 or 8 weeks at white tablecloth restaurants letting me pay for sea bass. 18 months of choices, every one of them hers, because that's the thing nobody told me when I was raising her. And the thing I'd like to tell you now, if you're listening. Character isn't a feeling. Character isn't what you say at your mother's funeral or what you post on her birthday. Character is what you do at 2 in the afternoon on the Tuesday when no one is watching, when you have a pen in your hand and a document in front of you, and a story you've told yourself about why it's okay just this once. Whitley made that decision in private, alone, 18 times at least by the count we eventually pulled together. And every one of those private decisions added up to the public moment when she sat across from me and asked me to bless what she'd already done. I made a decision in that booth too. I made the decision not to be the kind of father who absorbs the damage so the child never has to feel it. I had been that kind of father for 40 years, and I want to tell you, plain, that it did not produce a good adult. It produced an adult who believed that consequences were something other people had. Mercy is a real thing. I extended it to her children. I will extend it to her eventually in the form of not pursuing her into a federal courtroom. But mercy that costs nothing isn't mercy. It's surrender, wearing nicer clothes. And surrender is what built the 18 months in the first place. If you're a father or a mother and you're sitting where I was sitting, I want you to understand something. Strength is not loud. Strength is a yellow legal pad and a phone call to your attorney and a 5.5-hour drive to Asheville with the radio off. Strength is letting your daughter cry on your porch and not opening the door. Strength is not raising your voice. I never raised my voice. I never had to. The documents raised it for me. And wisdom, the kind that comes late and costs everything, is knowing the difference between what you owe your child and what you owe yourself. I owed Whitley a childhood, and she got one. I owed her honesty, and she got it. I did not owe her my dignity. And I did not owe her Rosemary's memory, and the day I stopped confusing love with self-erasure was the day I became someone Rosemary would have recognized again. I'm 68. I have a porch and a fishing rod and a son who calls me on Sundays. That is enough. That is, in fact, a great deal more than I deserved on the morning I drove home from that restaurant. Build the life that's worthy of the person you wanted to be. The rest sorts itself out, or it doesn't. And either way you sleep,